Okay, so we're going to do a special recorded lecture now to make up for the one we missed today by having Simon Draper and Suze Jessup down. We're going to look at anticipating reactions and counterfactuals. Okay. So we're going to look at two models today. One will be game theory and the other one will be counterfactuals. The objective here is to look at how we could model thinking ahead in foreign policy. So we've already spent a little bit of time in the course so far looking at how real-time decisions are made. In this scenario, a political leader is given a problem that's in the foreign policy realm, and he needs to, or she needs to respond in a way that is coherent and well thought through and addresses the national interests. So we have looked at real rational choice theory as being one model of sort of real-time thinking, where you make a decision based on identifying a goal, the number of different actions or options that might meet that goal, doing cost-benefit analysis, ranking the goal, the options, and then deciding on the goal, the option that meets the goal the best. Got there in the end. The other one we've looked at is emotions and how emotions, particularly values and beliefs and ideologies, might somehow skew that decision-making process. But what we haven't looked at is thinking ahead 2-3 steps. So that's what we're going to do today. First of all, we're going to have a look at 3 different types of game theory games and a little bit of background to how that works. Then we're going to look at 2 climate change games that came out of the Saurus reading that you've been given. We'll switch to counterfactuals, and then we'll very briefly look at some of the implications of this kind of thinking for your main essay project. So game theory is like rational choice theory, a model that was designed by economists, and it was picked up after the Second World War by political scientists, well, actually economists who work in the political science area, who were thinking about the implications of what the new nuclear threat and how we might negotiate with the USSR in the case of a possible nuclear confrontation. It uses mathematical concepts to model and predict interactions between multiple decision makers. So there are a number of games. We're going to look at the very simple ones today, ones that involve 2 players, but you can have multiple players. And we're also going to think about games that are 1 play only, as opposed to multiple plays. Our friend Thomas Schelling has said, most complex situations are essentially bargaining situations. They are situations in which the ability of one participant to gain his ends is dependent to an important degree on the choices or decisions that the other participant will make. So we're already familiar with that in the chess game, where you make a decision as to what move to make, but you think about what your opposing player will respond to with that move, what move they're most likely to make, and then for what move you would make after they'd made that move, and on as far as ahead as you can think. Again, it's important to mention that we're not talking about conflict necessarily in a sense of war, although obviously that's what Schelling was thinking about. We are interested in conflict as in competition that becomes aggressive, I suppose. So we might be talking about a trade negotiation, for instance. You're probably already aware that many trade negotiations rope in intelligence agencies in order to give the political decision maker some sort of insight as to what their competitor, who they're negotiating with, is thinking, and what they're planning to do. And at that point, game theory becomes useful in imagining scenarios that the other trade team might come up with, how they'll respond to what you suggest, how you could respond to their counterpoint, and vice versa to some degree into the future. The first game we're going to look at is the game of chicken. And this is the way, this here model is the way that it would be set out by an economist or any game theorist. So you have driver 1 and driver 2, and in the game of chicken, driver 1 and driver 2 are hurtling towards each other in their cars, and it's the winner is the person that doesn't swerve, continues straight ahead. So the loser is therefore the person that chickens out and swerves at the last moment. So you can see there are 4 configurations of that game, where driver 1 and driver 2 both swerve, where one of the drivers goes straight ahead and the other one swerves, and then another one where both go straight ahead and crash into each other. And you can see that there are payoffs here that are represented by the numerals in the middle. If both driver 1 and driver 2 swerve, then neither wins the game. They're both at 0 each. If driver 1 goes straight ahead and driver 2 swerves, then you have a payoff of -1 to driver 2, who loses the game, and +1 to driver 1, who wins the game. Alternatively, if driver 2 goes straight ahead and driver 1 swerves, you've got a payoff to driver 2 of +1 and a -1 to driver 1. And then, of course, the final scenario is that neither of them swerve. They both go straight into each other, in which case they both have a payoff of -2, and one imagines hospital or death. This is the game of chicken. The second game is called the prisoner's dilemma, and that's probably one you'll be more familiar with, at least in political science. I'm going to try and play this video down for you now, and let's see what happens when I get there.
The prisoner's dilemma has been studied for over 60 years for its insights into political, military, and economic affairs. It tells us that even when the best case scenario is clear, rational individuals acting in their own self-interest can bring about the worst case scenario. Let's see how it works. Imagine 2 criminals, we'll call them Xavier and Yoshi, who robbed a bank. They got caught. As a prosecutor, I don't have enough evidence to convict them, so I need a confession. I separate the 2, then offer each a deal. I tell Xavier, if you confess and turn Yoshi in, I'll let you go free. But if you don't confess and he turns you in, you'll take the fall and get 10 years in jail. Xavier, being a bright bank robber, wonders what happens if they both turn on each other. In that case, Mr. X, each of you will go to prison for 8 years. And if we both stay silent, Xavier asks, I can still get you on a lesser charge, a month each for weapons possession. I walk across the hall and offer Yoshi the exact same deal. I even tell him that I'm repeating the offer I made to Xavier. Here's the catch. Xavier and Yoshi can't coordinate with one another. If they could, they would certainly cooperate and keep their mouths shut, accepting a month in jail against the prospect of a decade. But taken in isolation, the rational bank robber will turn his partner in. Consider it from Yoshi's point of view. He's thinking, Either Xavier will cooperate and keep his mouth shut, or he'll defect and he'll turn me in. If he cooperates and I cooperate too, we get the best overall outcome, a month each in jail. Yet that still sends me to jail. If I defect, I get off scot-free. On the other hand, he could defect and confess what we've done. If that happens and I stay silent, I get 10 years in jail. If I defect as well, I get only 8 years. So no matter what Xavier does, Yoshi is better defecting and turning his partner in. Xavier, of course, is going through the exact same scenario in his head and coming to the conclusion that no matter what Yoshi does, he should defect and turn him in. Here's the mischievous pickle I put them in. The best case scenario is clear. They should both stay silent. But rational considerations will lead both to turn the other one in, leading to a worst case scenario. The classic real life example is nuclear deterrence. It's better to cooperate and avoid the risk and expense of maintaining giant nuclear stockpiles. But logic has led us to a world with thousands of weapons at the ready. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
Okay, so in that scenario, you have, as the commentator said, a situation where the prosecutor has created a problem for these two bank robbers, where he has made them have to choose defecting in two cases rather than cooperating. So here's the scenario again as a game theory model. You've got prisoner 1 and prisoner 2 have both been caught after a bank robbery, and they have been put into separate rooms and told a story by the prosecutor. And that story is that they have a choice between dobbing the other one in or not dobbing the other one in. And there will be different rewards or payoffs depending on which option they choose. So again, the scenario here is both don't decide not to confess, both decide to confess, or one confesses and the other one doesn't confess. As the commentator said, you would expect them to behave in a certain way. You would expect them to decide that it's in their interests not to cooperate, I should say, and for neither to dob each other in. But the particular way that this game is structured means that it makes it more in the interest to rat on the other guy. So we have 1 month each if neither confess, 1 month, 8 years each if both confess, but one goes for 10 years and the other one gets free if they rat on each other. And as the commentator said, this is something that Schelling was working on in terms of nuclear confrontation. What Schelling wanted to know was, is there ever going to be a time where the one or the other of the two states, USSR and USA, might decide to do a preemptive strike on the other? It doesn't make any sense if you look at it logically that either would want to push the button and get this thing started, but there might be a particular instance where the payoffs incentivize one state to actually attack the other. Each player, says Schelling, in that book of strategy and conflict that we looked at, we saw the introduction to each player would now rather attack than hope for a joint non-attack. In other words, he would attack even if he shouldn't attack. Okay, the third game theory model that we're going to look at is called the stag hunt, and you'll see a little bit of the stag hunt discussed in the Mitzen and Schweller article, which, yes, I confess is a rather long, rather lengthy article, where they discuss the security dilemma. The focus of the article for us in our reading report is not so much the security dilemma, even though we've covered it in class, but to think more about the misplaced certainty angle that he discusses in depth later on. The stag hunt is a very different game from the prisoner's dilemma, in that this time we're starting to look at cooperation. In this scenario, two individuals go out on a hunt. They can individually choose to hunt either a stag or a hare. There's one stag in the forest and two hares, but they must take along hunting weapons that will only be good for hunting one or the other. You cannot catch a stag with the hunting equipment used for a hare, and you cannot catch a hare with the hunting equipment used for a stag. And while you can catch a hare alone, you need two people to catch a stag. And finally, and most obviously, the stag has more meat on it than two hares, so it's worth 6 points, and a hare is worth 2 points. So if they both cooperate, then they can get to the share of the stag. They'll have half each. If they both cooperate on the two hares, they get a hare each. So like the prisoner's dilemma, each player must choose an initial action without knowing the choice of the other. The best payoff for them in this particular case is to select the stag hunting equipment and get more meat. But if you select the stag hunting equipment and the other guy, the hare hunting equipment, neither comes away with any meat at all. So the stag hunt is therefore a game where the incentive is to cooperate rather than to betray. Okay, now we're going to look at the Soros article, which starts to make implications of game theory in choosing climate change solutions. Right? Soros is writing in 1992, which is a few years ago now, but he's pioneering some of the ideas that are now acceptable in the era of climate change, but were very contentious at the time. First, there's the debate over whether environmental security or the threats that ecological trends pose to human welfare can be categorized in the way that we normally think about security issues. You know, we were talking just there about nuclear wars. Can we think in the same way about the threats that are imposed to us in terms of climate change? And security issues, of course, we think of the defense of sovereign states against violent attack, either from states or from terrorist or revolutionary groups within their borders. The concept of environmental security is contested partly because it made the whole category of security far too big. You know, what do you actually think security is? One of the things that we noticed in the National Security Conference that we had back in February, which I hope you will go to again next February, was that a pandemic is now a national security issue. It has implications both on our economy, on the welfare of our people, and obviously, perhaps a little bit further down the track, our ability to defend ourselves. The security before had been a very narrow thing. It had been where we needed to use the military, or there was some sort of violence of some kind as a solution. But as Soros points out, military insecurities are usually created by hostile other states, whereas environmental threats are something that happens incrementally and day to day. To this end, it's very difficult for some states to get their heads around environmental threats, particularly developing countries, we're addressing poverty at the same time it means upheavals to the industrialized production. This is their escape from poverty. They don't want to stop the factories polluting, because to stop the factories means a downturn in the economy. So unlike the competitive nature of war, environmental security involves some kind of cooperation and exchange of information on the solutions to climate change and investment into initiatives that ignore national borders. So Soros likens the payoffs that we're looking at in terms of environmental security to the prisoner's dilemma. That is, while it's in everybody's interests to cooperate, it's more tempting to betray while everybody else cooperates. It's not desirable for you to cooperate if nobody else does. Therefore, it's preferable, at least in the short term, for everyone to betray each other rather than for everyone to cooperate. So he illustrates this with two problems. The first one we're going to look at is a reduction of CO2 and the alternative of building sea walls to keep the oceans, the rising ocean levels out. In this scenario, the sea levels are rising. Option one is the state is to build sea walls, keep the oceans out. This is betrayal, because you only look after your own state's interests. Option B is to pay the costs of reducing CO2 emissions so that the oceans don't rise. For instance, get rid of the factories or the farms that increase CO2. It's expensive to do, but it is cooperation because you help everybody. So you can see the optimum result is if you build seawalls cheaply while everybody else pays the costs of reducing CO2 emissions. They do all the hard work for you. In other words, you don't reduce the CO2 emissions, but you guard against everyone else betraying you by making sure those walls go up. The worst result for you would be to reduce CO2 emissions while everybody else builds sea walls. Their CO2 emissions will continue, the oceans rise, and you can't stop them flooding your country. The next most tempting result would be for you to build sea walls while everybody else does. You haven't taken the risk of cooperating, and while the damage is bad, it's not as bad as if you cooperated when everybody else had betrayed you. So then Soros looks at a second one, which is CFCs versus sunscreen. This does show the age of the article, because the idea that CFCs were going to create a hole in the ozone layer is very much a 1980s problem, but it's still applicable today. So this is an example of environmental security where states did cooperate with each other. The incentives in this case were greater than the incentives to betray. So in this scenario, the two options were to either ban CFCs, which were causing the breakdown of the ozone layer, and were in refrigerators for the most part, also spray cans, or slapping sunscreen and letting it get worse. Unlike the sea walls, the sunscreen provides no real defense. So in this case, the best strategy is to cooperate. It's therefore not a prisoner's dilemma at all, but a stag hunt where cooperation is preferred to betrayal. Now we're going to look at counterfactuals. Whereas the central idea of game theory is that certain conditions create positions for states where they almost can't back down. They can either decide that it's in their interest to not cooperate or their interest to cooperate. We, in this case, look at counterfactuals to look at possible other worlds or other histories that might happen, because certain conditions in this case took place over others. And counterfactuals simply mean contrary to the facts, or an event that didn't occur. what if situations, like the question, what if Nazi Germany had won the Second World War? Counterfactuals are therefore thought experiments where a single change in the course of events can set history on a new trajectory, which in turn provides us with a better understanding of the past. That is, when you engage in counterfactuals, you try to predict what would happen if a few elements of the story had been changed, with a focus on varying conditions that seem important or manipulable. For instance, if in the case of what if Germany had won the Second World War, the varying condition in this case might be what if the USA had not entered the war on Britain's side but stayed neutral. I'm not going to play this, I'll put it on Facebook because every time I change things, I bugger it up. So to do that, to think about what might happen in the future, it's necessary to look for necessary or sufficient causes. A necessary cause is one that must exist in order for the phenomenon to happen. It had to be in place in order for that history to take place. A sufficient cause is any possible cause, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a necessary one. In the case of Germany winning the Second World War, it may be sufficient but not necessary that US enter the war on Britain's side. When you work with counterfactuals, you're entering the world of hypothesis testing. I claim that X caused Y. To clarify my claim, let me explain Y image of a world absent X. Or if it had been the case that C or not C, it would have been the case that E or not E. So to use our World War II example, I claim that US entering the world on Britain's side caused Germany to lose the war. Therefore, let me explain the war without USA joining it. Counterfactuals are often used by policymakers to work their way through problems and reach decisions, and can help us understand how, having taken different routes, we might have achieved better outcomes. Policymakers are not the only people who use counterfactuals. Intelligence analysts often do too. Counterfactual thought experiments, says Richard Ned Lebeau, who's a famous constructivist at King's College London, provide a vantage point for taking ourselves outside of our world and our assumptions about it, where they can be subjected to active and open interrogation. Such an exercise not only makes us aware of assumptions that are so deeply ingrained that we take them for granted, but facilitates imaginative leaps in theory and hypothesis formation. We've looked at hindsight bias before, the idea that looking back, an event was bound to happen and there was nothing you or I could do about it. In arguing why we should use counterfactuals, Lebeau says IR theory often makes it look like world historical events were unpreventable. A realist will argue that structural forces made the Cold War inevitable. A democratic peace theorist would say that the Second World War was simply a case of two competing ideologies or competing regime types, democracies fighting non-democracies. These explanations make it look to us that history is in some way predetermined, and IR theories tend to rubbish the idea that history can be accidental or contingent on a number of things happening. If that's true, then as IR theorists, we'd be guilty of committing hindsight bias. So we're now going to have a look at our problem as we set it up the other day. The PM wants New Zealand to leave the United Nations. What would government do? Leave, stay, or modify the UN somehow? How would your policy affect New Zealand and our relationship with our defence and trading partners? So when we use critical theory, what does a problem represent theory the other day, we started to take apart the question in terms of a problematizing scenario. What we're going to do now is we're going to take apart the question as a counterfactual exercise. So what are the key conditions that would be important or manipulable here? Well, one of the obvious ones is that the United Nations is one of the key liberal order institutions post-1945. It was set up in order to create peace. There was a charter that everybody signed that said that we would discuss these things. It became a bit of a talk fest, but ostensibly it was a place where states could get together and resolve their conflicts without taking them to war. Another key condition that we have that's important or manipulable is that we have populist leaders in the USA and the UK, with Trump and Farage now leading those two respective countries, and in New Zealand with Jamie Lee Ross as our new Prime Minister. And you could argue that at least some of what they're trying to do is undermine the liberal order institutions like NATO in Trump's case, like the WTO, which in the Trump administration was also not supported by the Americans, and also in this case, the United Nations. We also know that China, Russia, and France want to remain in the United Nations Security Council. They've discussed bringing on board Japan and India. We can imagine a United Nations Security Council, which in many cases actually resolves or at least determines the agenda that's being discussed at the General Assembly, to now be dominated in particular by China in the absence of US. And also, lastly, without US support, the United Nations may not have a home. It's currently mostly housed in New York City, or sufficient funding to continue. So let's look at some other scenarios. In counterfactual number 1, we have another institution that replaces the United Nations. The United Nations folds without the support of the main players, or at least the US, and something else comes about as a result of it folding. Here's an example that was put forward in 2012 by a gentleman, Dr. Lamont Colucci, who discussed a democratic alliance of nations. He wanted it to be created in Vienna. He wanted it modeled on NATO. In this case, it would be unlike the United Nations in so much as it would be a military body with political support. It includes a supreme commander, therefore, and NATO has a supreme commander at the moment, and a rotating political head. Only nations that are willing to employ proportional military force, not just token support, but actually serious about it, would be allowed to be members. Article 5, which is the article in the NATO treaty that says that any attack on one is an attack on all, could still be triggered, but it included a preemptive and preventative measures, as well as a mechanism to deal with genocide, massive human rights abuses, regional despotism, rogue states, and failed states. So in this scenario, we replace a largely toothless United Nations with one with real teeth, one with a real military force that backs up the rules or the laws that are created by this democratic alliance of nations with military force if necessary, and can be used for quite liberal aims like dealing with genocide, human rights abuses, or getting rid of dictators. In our second counterfactual, we assume that the United Nations goes under, collapses, and takes a whole lot of United Nations institutions with them. And I just wanted to really list those many. There are more than the ones that I've listed here, but We're talking about the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the International Labour Organization, the International Monetary Fund, which helps struggling countries overcome their economic problems, or gets them into worse ones, depending on your point of view. The International Maritime Organization, the International Telecommunication Union, UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, the UN Industrial Development Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, and the World Bank Group, which lends money to struggling countries who are having problems with their economy. You can see that this is a much more illustrative showing of the problem, which is that so many of our international accords since the Second World War in the areas of aviation and telecommunications and meteorology and maritime things have all been under the umbrella of the United Nations. So when we make international laws, when we decide on ways that we're going to behave in relation to other states, the United Nations has been quite instrumental in that kind of seamless delivery. It's also been, as I can point out here, instrumental in solving issues around development and aid, in making sure that countries understand modern agricultural processes, in making sure that labour is in some way regulated to avoid things like slavery where possible, and also in terms of, as I said before, economies that are falling over, being propped up or being reformed in a way where money is necessary and they can take up big loans. An example of that, which Van Gallis will talk about, I'm sure, when he comes down to see us, was the World Trade Organization, who during the Trump administration was very much under threat of collapse when the US repeatedly blocked the confirmation of judges to the appellate body. So what happened was the US refused to appoint any new judges. We got down to, I think, 2 in the end. And it became almost impossible to resolve trading disputes as a result of that. And it was, again, another instance of the US, like the Kyoto and Paris Agreement protocols, not wanting to be involved with any international organization. The same is true of the World Court, that might reflect badly on the United States, might get the United States into trouble. Simply a case of the major power not wanting to be bound by the rules that everybody else was bound to. So you can see that if one falls, others might fall as well, and you might be living in a world where there are no international organizations able to regulate simple things like trade disputes, work disputes, in the way countries interface with each other. Counterfactual 3 has China and Russia dominating global institutions. Global order in which the USA is absent is going to create opportunities for China in particular, but also Russia and other non-liberal states to fill the vacuum. Hal Brands and Jake Sullivan argued back in 2020 that China would grudgingly accept that it could not displace the United States from Asia, or push the US Navy beyond the Western Pacific island chain, at least for the foreseeable future. In other words, while China would be a growing dominant player in world affairs, it wasn't going to be able to knock the US out. It would instead place increasing emphasis on shaping the world's economic rules, technology standards, and political institutions to its advantage and in its image. And that's something Simon talked about today in our lecture in response to Sophie's question, where he said, well, you know, it's hardly surprising that China would want to assert itself now that it's a rising power. It's just a question of what we're prepared to let it assert itself on or in. In this case, perhaps China takes over the main dominance of the United Nations. What are the implications of that? In my fourth counterfactual, and by no means is this a comprehensive list, France and Switzerland offer a new home to the United Nations in Paris and Geneva, and perhaps the EU steps in to fund the part that the USA has now declined to fund. Stepping up as one of the three remaining members of the United Nations Security Council, France gets support from Russia and China to relocate the General Assembly to Paris, and the Security Council to Geneva in Switzerland, which of course is neutral and might be a more fitting place for a Security Council than New York City. The EU then proposes replacing France's membership of the United Nations Security Council with a single EU seat and taking over the funding previously given by the USA. This proposal triggers interest in regional-based membership. So perhaps the United Nations Security Council, instead of being represented by US, UK, France, China, Russia, as being the permanent five, now becomes a regional-based one with Europe, maybe East Asia, maybe the Pacific, some sort of, maybe Africa or the South American continent as being the new members of the council. So you'd have a much perhaps fairer view that wasn't necessarily one where the interests of particular states took precedence. So that's counterfactual 4. So those counterfactuals are presented to you just as a way of thinking about what kind of shape you could imagine the world would be in if the United Nations was abandoned, or how it might be reshaped to be something quite different to what it is now, with different support from different players. So just in summary, this lecture's been about thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. Obviously, political leaders, when they make a decision, have to anticipate the reactions of their competitors or their adversaries, and then think through what their reaction might be once their adversary has responded. We ask the question, do states consider payoffs when making foreign policy? Well, of course they do. Do states consider payoffs when they decide to abandon or take over the United Nations? Well, of course they do. Are these payoffs also domestic political ones? Well, in the case of Jamie Lee Ross as our new Prime Minister, yes, he has to think about what's going to happen when he enacts a certain policy with his electorate. Will they continue to support him? What will the consequences of that policy be? And will they withdraw their support once they see the effects of that policy in action? And that might be something that you want to think about when you're persuading him to either stay or modify the United Nations. We're thinking in counterfactuals, what would the world be like without the United Nations? What sort of world without those major institutions that bring it seamlessly together? What sort of world would it be if we replaced the United Nations with something quite different? What kind of world would we have if the United Nations was run by non-liberal states like China, or some pairing of China and Russia? We're already seeing China and Russia getting increasingly closer together, and we don't want to necessarily see them get any closer. And are there alternatives to the US-dominated world, like the EU stepping into the frame, or is the guarantee that they offer currently with military might as well as soft power something that's integral to the peace and well-being of our world? it's something for you to decide. Okay, this week we've got Emily Wright coming in at 10 a.m. in Burn 6. I do hope you'll make it to that. Emily is very similar to Sue's in age, perhaps a bit younger than Sue's, and definitely there to help answer your questions. But she's also going to talk a little bit about her role with the ISIS refugees that are coming out of Syria into Turkey. We had one a few weeks ago with a mother with 2 young children who was fleeing Syria and ended up in the hands of the Turkish authorities, and it was New Zealand's role to try to decide what to do with them. So Burn 6, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Next week, as I said earlier, we have Anzac Day, so there's no lectures or tutorials in that week, but you do have a reading report due. And then the following week, we have Sir Don McKinnon coming down. Sir Don was Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade under the Bolger government a few years back now. He was the Deputy Prime Minister there as well. And after he quit his role in politics in New Zealand, he went on to become the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. So he's a very high-powered individual. He's going to talk to us about New Zealand's role as a peacemaker. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll catch up with you again in 2 weeks' time.